Hello, economics students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 15, Section 2, Stabilization Policies. Anytime that we talk about the economy, we've got to figure out some kind of policy to kind of control, the ups and down cycles of economics. And it really comes down to looking at some different policies. We are going to look at the demand side policy, the supply side policy, and basically what is known as monetary policies. And each has its own benefits and limitations by all means. So, demand side policies, this is the introduction on that. What is the goal of demand side policies? And part of that is to increase or decrease the total demand in the economy. This really goes back to a guy named John Maynard Keynes, who we're going to take a look at. But the idea is so that you can stimulate consumption of goods and services. You're going to toy with that demand. And the government's role is going to be offsetting those changes in the investment sector and spending. Also using some kind of automatic stabilizers as far as policy to kind of make those things happen. So, what is this policy and from whom's theories does it devise? It's a federal government's attempt to influence or stabilize the economy through taxing and government spending. And it's derived from John Maynard Keynes or Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes was British. He was a economist that lived kind of during the early part of the 20th century. He wrote a lot during the post World War I era into the pre World War II era, and he had a huge influence not only when you talk about British economics, but when you look at what was happening here in the United States. Some of his ideas kind of rubbed off on some of our politicians. So when you start looking at things like the New Deal, or if you look at kind of the post-World War II economy. Some of it's got a little flavor of Keynesian in it. And, to maybe understand our economy, you kind of have to go back and look at him to kind of get your head around it. So Keynesian economics, according to Kinsey, which fact or sector of the economy creates economic instability? And that's the business sector. Okay, and part of that is because they're probably more vulnerable to ups and downs as far as what's going to happen. And if you can put some controls there, you might be able to stabilize the economy. Now, in the United States, when we talk about putting controls on business, that usually gets people in the business world all rattled. I would say this Keynesian philosophies probably play really well with, let's say, politically Democrats opposed to Republicans, because Republicans are probably more business minded. And for the most part, they don't like having all of the legislation hampering their activities. So that's one way to kind of understand maybe where Kinsey's coming from. So the role of government, what is Kinsey's justification for temporary federal deficits? Thought that they were unfortunate, but they were necessary to stop further declines in economic activity. And it's kind of these ideas that kind of play into the whole idea of the New Deal under FDR. FDR basically thought, one way to kind of stabilize our economy is for us to kind of, rake up a little bit of deficit during the 1930s to kind of help offset the economic downtimes. The question that would be there is like, how do you stabilize that after the fact? And it's one of the issues that I guess we've had to really wrestle with and in regards to Keynesian philosophies. Automatic stabilizers. Okay, these are some tools that were used in that demand side policy. These are programs that automatically trigger benefits and changes in the economy threaten income. So if the economy starts going downward, then certain payments to people are going to be going up. In other words, those handouts that the government's giving could add up into a higher deficit, and that kind of gets people a little worried, as far as the debt that can mean to a country. Limitations of the fiscal policy. What is the most effective at countering the business cycles? A lot of people say these automatic stabilizers. Okay, whether you love them politically or not. All right. That's demand side. We're going to talk about supply side. So, what is supply side policies? This is policy designed to stimulate output and lower unemployment by increasing production rather than stimulating demand. Now, there's a downside. Anytime that you build up supply, that might mean at some point in time you have too much on hand. And if you have too much on hand, then that might eventually lead to some issues with employment and such. So, there's a smaller role for government here. What are some of the ways that the government's role in the economy can be reduced? And that is by reducing the number of federal agencies, spending less, by implementing deregulation. This is something that we did during the Reagan administration. When Ronald Reagan came into the White House, that was one of the things that he wanted to do, was to kind of make the size of government smaller. It really didn't happen, but that was something that he championed. That was something he talked a lot about. And there are times when we have politicians today that would love to get rid of some of these extra federal agencies, cut some of that government spending, in hopes that maybe you could actually stimulate the economy. Okay, so politically, your Democrats like demand side, your Republicans probably are a little more supply side minded. Okay, but there's got to be a balance here. So, lowering federal taxes is something that supply siders like. So, what is the supply siders' argument for lower taxes? Supply siders would argue that if the federal tax rate was lower, individuals would have be able to keep more of their earnings, and hence they might go out and try to spend more. That might also encourage you to work harder, and so that's something that I've seen in recent years with Republican presidents. When you go back and you look at presidents since Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, if you look at the Trump administration, all are kind of this mindset. There are limitations of the supply side policy. Um, Lack of experience with supply side policies to know what effect they can have on the economy. And sometimes when we implement policies, got to remember when we write legislation, it's not just one political party, it's both parties, if not independents as well. And sometimes we don't know what the full impact that's going to be. Because everything is kind of still in flux when you talk about all the different variables that are out there. And we don't know what the full impact is going to be. Okay, so that's one limitation that we have to really be aware of. Aside from demand side and supply side, there are what we call monetary policies. And certainly we have a lot of this that's going on in our economy as well. A lot of this is coming out of the Federal Reserve, or those people who are economists, are mathematicians, who are crunching the numbers. Who are the monetarists, and what kind of policies do they favor to combat inflation? These are the people who place primary importance on the role of money in the economy. They favor policies that are going to lead to stable long-term monetary growth at levels low enough to control inflation. So they're always going to be looking at little things that we can do to tweak the economy. And I'll tell you right now, a lot of what we're doing in our nation currently is based on this monetary policy, where occasionally we're going to, we're faced with a crisis. We implement a quick policy, and it kind of tweaks the economy a little bit to kind of stabilize it. So we don't have like a spike in inflation, or an economic downturn that's so devastating that you're going to lead to widespread unemployment. Part of this has led our nation to be somewhat stable. All right. Thank you so much.